Welcome. Today I want to talk about why I annotate fiction books. And this is a question that I often get. So today I'm answering that in this very casual video. I am also going to show you what's inside my reading box, because this is a box that I keep by my side whenever I read, with some essentials that I always need because I don't want to get up when I'm reading. I'm going to end the video with a real life example of my notes on a certain book that I did, just to give you an idea about what I write down in my notes. But first, why? I actually jotted down all of the reasons why I annotate books. The first reason is that my passive reading becomes active reading. When I make notes on a book and when I write about the topics of the book, when I keep my favorite passages, it helps me with paying attention. I notice more details. And I also notice that when I do this, I tend to remember more details about the book that I read. Number two is I am building a database, and I want to be able to look at the notes that I made about a certain book to refresh my memory. And yes, this also goes for fiction books, because there is so much value to be found and so much wisdom to be found in fiction as well. There are life lessons to reflect on and so much more. And so I collect my favorite passages, but also passages that make me think, that hold wisdom. And why this is so wonderful, and this only works when you return to these passages regularly, that is, if you're rereading them, they kind of become part of yourself, and they are a way of helping you express yourself better to other people. So I always try not to just copy, but to really try and state things in my own words and make the quote my own. Number four is my writing skills. So when I write about certain topics in a book, certain things that happened, you start thinking about things that you normally would not think about. And this is really interesting. It first and foremost helps you with your writing skills. And secondly, it really forces you to think about certain things in life. In novels, we often have situations that don't really happen to you in your life, but you're still forced to think about them. And that to me is very interesting. Number five, it is a different kind of journaling. So journaling is really great to process things, but it is, I find it personally very difficult, and I know a lot of people think this. It is difficult to journal just about the things that happen to you in your life. For example, I have a very boring life. Not a lot of things are happening here. And so it helps to be able to, instead of talking about my own life, talk about things on the page that happen to other people, and just things that concern the world in general and not just my own life. It gets you out of this bubble, and soon you will be writing about things that you never thought you would write about. And I genuinely believe that if you want to really get to know your own opinion about something, you have to either discuss this with someone, have a deep conversation, or have a deep conversation with yourself and write it on the page. That is what I found. If I start writing about certain topics, I really begin to think about things very deeply. And number six, it's interesting to keep track of things that you want to research. For example, vocabulary that you don't understand, or the author mentions a historical figure or a craft that you know nothing about, or a topic you know nothing about. It's so nice to be able to just type it into the internet, Google it, see what it means, research it, and this way I am learning so much. Number seven, it allows me to return to the things that I want to return to later, because you cannot possibly remember everything, which is why it's important to write things down and to return to them just so you can memorize them. It is impossible to remember everything, and so it's really nice to have a place to return to. Number eight, It makes it easier to make connections to other works that you've read. For example, when you have two novels with very similar themes, it's just interesting to compare. It is interesting to see and to compare how these authors have approached the topic or theme. And finally, I find it to be very relaxing and fulfilling. I just love doing it. It's some kind of ritual for me, and it just brings me into this deep focus. I do want to mention, and this is why I love the classics so much, it is more difficult to do with modern books. I find that when I pick up a modern book, I don't really have that many annotations, because older books tend to be more challenging in so many ways. There are a lot of things to look up. We don't live in that time period, so you often need to research a little bit about the author and about the time period the novel is taking place in. They don't just hand you information, you really have to work. And a lot of modern books make it a little bit easier for the reader, and they go on and explain things to you. So yes, I find it way easier to do with older books. And it's definitely one of the reasons why I prefer reading older books. They make me work harder, they make me think harder. I'm not saying that there's no quality in modern books and that there's nothing to get out of them. There are so many books published every day, and it's harder to make a selection. Whereas with the classics, you have time that made a selection for you, and the ones still in print are usually worth reading. So yes, this is why I love annotating fiction so much. I will now give you an example of my notes. This is very personal. I will show you a book that I recently made notes on, annotated, and that is Notes from the Underground by Dostoevsky. And I do want to mention that I don't always have extensive notes. Sometimes I just have 3 quotes in one book, which is fine as well. Sometimes they're pretty extensive because some books just demand a lot of research, background information, and this was one of those books. Before I dive into my notes, I want to say my goodbyes by showing you what's in my reading box. So I keep a box next to me whenever I sit in this chair reading, because I want to have all my essentials with me and I don't want to get up. I'm using an old chocolate box, but I'm still trying to find something at an antique market that's big enough to hold my journal. So in here I keep my journal to make notes, but I also keep some tabs. I have 2 alcohol-free markers. These are from Tombow, and I have a creamy one and a gray one. And then I also have a pen. This is a Pilot G-Tech C4, and this one doesn't bleed through the page. I have a pouch with a lot of tabs and a pencil. And then I have 3 cards that I use when I don't want to write in my book, and I just stick them in between the pages and then copy them in my Notion app. I also recently was gifted this, I don't even know what to call this, but you have to put your thumb inside and it keeps the page open so you can read with one hand, which is handy when there's a cat on your lap. I always have cats on my lap. I've recently been having a lot of pain in my thumb on the left side, and I think it's from keeping open my books for so many hours a day. I don't know if that's a thing, but I'm trying this out and I don't know, I will make up my mind later because I really don't know if this works, but I must say that it's handy because I can just cuddle the cat and read with one hand. This is a bookmark that I'm currently using for Walter Scott's Kenilworth. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's the book that I'm currently reading. Anyway, that was my reading box, and yes, the box is from a Belgian chocolate brand. We have the best chocolate here in Belgium. I will now say my goodbyes and share the notes I made for Notes from the Underground. Hello and welcome to my notes. First of all, this is the background information that I looked up about Notes from the Underground. It was also a book club pick, so I did some research to share with everyone. And these are just some interesting facts that I gathered that were interesting to share. Determinism was also a very important aspect, and so I did some research on that as well. Did some summaries and where it came from, and then also reference to Chernyshevsky's novel What's to Be Done, which I also read as a preparation for reading this book. Here's a quote from the book that I marked, and then I also wrote my opinion after I finished the book. Then while reading, so I make my notes in Notion, where I always mark the date when I finished it. So here, in this book, I went chapter by chapter. I don't always write summaries of every chapter, but sometimes I do. And this was a short book. So here I have some notes on chapter 1 and also mingled with some history. So if I read something and I want to research something, I also write it down here. In chapter 2, there was a reference to insects who do not overthink. And this referenced to Hegel's The Beautiful and Sublime, which I also wrote down here. This comes from Wikipedia, and so I also wrote a little bit about that. And in chapter 3, I wrote something about L'homme de la nature et de la vérité by Rousseau, which is a universal man, which was also something that came up in the book. So I think you get what I'm doing here. I also try to write down new words that I am not familiar with or that I want to know more about. For example, here, obscurantist, or however you pronounce it, is a person who deliberately prevents the facts or full details of something from becoming known. And of course, we have some more quotes, something about Henry Thomas Buckle. And finally, I always try to make a list of references, so books or authors or works that have been mentioned in the book. And so in this case, it was, for example, Byron, Gogol, Ivan Gonkarov, and George Sand. And then finally, I also did a sheet for the book club. Here I have a short summary of what the novel is about, what translation I read, what edition I read, the author. Then here are my thoughts, some of my favorite quotes, and then the references. I hope this gave you a little bit of an idea of how I handle things, how I make my notes. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.